Welcome back to the Metahumanism podcast. Today we will continue a discussion of metahumanism, looking more closely at its relation to several posthumanist alternatives, as well as to transhumanism. For those of you new to my channel, I'm Bogdan, and this is the fourth video in the initial introductory series providing background information about myself, this channel, this podcast, and about what you can expect from it in the future. I invite you to watch the previous three videos I've posted. If you haven't done so yet, you'll learn more about where I come from, what the definition of philosophy is, what its main branches are, and what the definition of the classical humanism is. And so today we're just continuing. Last episode I looked at the development of humanist thought and practice, and to sum up and reiterate it very briefly, there are three complementary components to humanism. One is classicism in culture, so focus on ancient Greek and Roman classical culture. The humanist education is the second one. So like logic, rhetoric, dialectics, grammar, and other disciplines, related disciplines, history, poetry. And the third is the philosophical human-centered perspective, anthropocentrism. In the last episode, I also briefly described how the legacy of humanism managed to endure through the centuries, despite the gradual decline in the first two components, the classicism and the humanist education, and despite all the tensions inherent in the third component, in the philosophical anthropocentrism of humanism. I traced the development of humanist thought into the late modernity of the second half of the 20th century. And now we're just kind of picking up where we left off the last episode. Before we continue examining the history of this humanist development, let's take a look at how it relates to modernism and colonialism. Those are the two other perspectives on this channel, as I described last time. Postcolonialism and metamodernism. So to begin, let's look at the concept of modernity just for a brief moment. As a historical period, modernity, as opposed to modernism, which is a more explicit philosophical and artistic movement in aesthetic and philosophical movement that emerged in the early 20th century, at the turn of 20th century, but most developed expression of it came in early decades of 20th century. And so modernity, as a historical period, not as a specifically philosophical current, is usually dated to have begun around the middle of the 18th century with the formulation of the philosophy of the Enlightenment, following the transitional early modern period between the Middle Ages preceding it and the modernity succeeding it. So that included, that early modern transitional period included Renaissance humanism of 13th and 15th centuries, and then the subsequent scientific revolution of in natural sciences and knowledge in 16th and 17th century. Then, in the post-war environment of the second half of the 20th century, as early as about 1940s for the first critiques of modernism and the 1950s for the first critiques of colonialism, both humanism and modernism came under critical examination. And in the subsequent decades since 40s and the 50s, the philosophy of the Enlightenment and the scientific endeavor itself, which are characterized by optimism, rationalism, anthropocentrism, and Eurocentrism. So these perspectives became the focus of a consistent and systematic philosophical criticism and deconstruction by the overlapping postmodernist, postcolonial, and posthumanist perspectives. So the prime time for all of these three posts came in the 70s and the 80s, in the wake of the global upheavals following 1968, Just to refresh everyone's memory, in the USA, the Martin Luther King Jr. was and Robert Kennedy were assassinated in '68. And then the wide-scale rioting followed from after that, the anti-war movement, the Woodstock Festival, and the next year, and also social unrest also occurred in a number of other locations and cities across the world, like Paris, Mexico City, Prague, just to name a few of the most prominent ones. Most of the pivotal theoretical works that were questioning modernism, humanism, and colonialism were published by the end of the '70s. So the historical period of postmodernity is seen by some to have arrived sometime in the '70s with the accelerating processes of globalization, informatization, right, in information science, computers, and proliferation of neoliberal governance. I'm sorry. The postmodernist critique is characterized by intense irony, skepticism, fundamental relativism, emphasis on fragmentation and multiple perspectives, and deep skepticism of any overarching social theories that are offered as an explanation of the social reality of history, what they called grand narratives, quote unquote. So there is some legitimate question today just how much this kind of postmodernist critique is responsible for the current regime of post-truth politics when, and I'm using a quote here, nothing is true and everything is possible. That's a quote from Peter Pomerantsev, who wrote an eponymous book about Putin's regime in Russia and how it functions. And the same kind of politics also characterizes how Trumpism functions as well. And I will link, give a few links about this. So there's this article that examining connections between postmodernism and this post-truth that we are facing, regimes, political regimes. And I'll quote directly from the article briefly. So I'm reading, did postmodernism have any part to play in the rise of the post-truth era? At first glance, that seems very hard to believe. When we see Kellyanne Conway talking about alternative facts, or Rudy Giuliani saying truth isn't truth, we don't immediately assume they've been busy reading Jacques Derrida and Richard Rorty. Still, maybe the question isn't quite so simple. End of the quote. So Derrida is a prominent French philosopher of deconstruction. That's one of the postmodernist theories. And Rorty is an American pragmatist philosopher who also questioned the very existence of objective truth. So, as the articles goes on to argue, postmodern ideas did not remain confined to academia, and they gradually seeped through and circulated in the wider culture, and frequently being misunderstood or misappropriated, or as often happens with philosophical ideas, and spreading this superficial notion that each person has his or her own truth, and that it's impolite or even oppressive or hegemonic to suggest that someone could simply be wrong or to question their truth, their version of truth. So every perspective was seen as a mere narrative. All narratives were equally valid. The idea of gatekeeping culture was discredited, and at which point the proverbial barbarians could demand equal access to the civil public square. So any perspective, no matter how divorced from reality or not based on true facts, was demanding equal attention. So the article is also careful to point out that postmodernism as critique was not all bad. It's not. It needs to be pointed out that it sought to undermine the intellectual hegemony of this dominant perspective, which was white, male, heterosexual, Western perspective, viewpoint. And it revealed that these claims to universality of even such things as human rights often these claims were often merely a cover for Eurocentric and hegemonic attitudes towards the rest of the world. So this opened up a space for alternative perspectives and ways of thinking to be taken seriously. So that's where, for example, postcolonialism comes in, and it fits into postmodernist critique as well. So to decolonize imperial narratives that pre-existed. And so arguably it wasn't So, however, this critique, as good as it was and had some salutary effects, it wasn't. It's not quite clear whether postmodernism was really necessary to achieve that effect. Meaning that arguably it wasn't necessary to attack the very notion of universality or objective truth. You could have done the decolonization and critiquing these perspectives in different ways. And there were some different ways, as we'll look at in a second. So as the recent events amply demonstrate, when we face outright lies posing as truths, we should call them what they are. We shouldn't just cower, retreat, and claim that no objective truth is possible. Another way of saying it is that you may be entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. So in a future video, actually, I intend to take a kind of closer look at what the varieties of facts that we face in our daily lives and how different categories of facts become established. So one of the alternatives to postmodernist perspective that also looks at the late 20th century and the social changes happening comes from sociologists and social theorists of the late modernity, as they call it, and they also have other terms. These theorists are some of them are Anthony Giddens, the British, Pierre Bourdieu from France, Zygmunt Bauman, and Ulrich Beck. Beck is from Germany, I believe, among others. But those are some of the prominent ones, and they proposed a more moderate version of modernity, not postmodernism, but not postmodernity, but radicalized, liquid, or reflexive modernity. Those are their terms, which means that the modernity is in the late 20th century was characterized by accelerating speed of change and social change, with consequently increasing risks. So there's a concept of risk society that comes from Ulrich Beck, for example, and then by greater self-awareness and agency accessible to individuals in societies. So who can use that agency to mitigate those various risks, various structural risks. So many of these thinkers I just mentioned, they examined that dimension of what they called, Giddens expressly, called duality of structure and agency. So there are historical and social structures, and then there's individual agency that can make change within those structures. And it's a kind of process of negotiation, I guess. Is one way to describe it. So they focused on how that functions within the late modern societies. A third perspective, so postmodernist and then radicalized modernity. And the third perspective eventually emerged in the early 21st century, namely metamodernity. And that's our present time. You know, we're some people argue that now we're in a period of meta-modern period. It's no longer post-modernity, it's beyond modernity. And what that means is that the new world is struggling to be born on the ruins of the old one, and all kinds of monsters are emerging to take advantage of these times of many crises. To remind of that quote I used in my very first episode from Antonio Gramsci about the monsters and times of change. The metamodern perspective is basically characterized by looking at oscillations between the sincerity and optimism of modernity and more certainty and about truth and reality, and the irony and skepticism and the uncertainty and the perspectivism of postmodernity. So seeking to bridge the two perspectives and move beyond both of them. So we can't go back to seeing things how we saw them before the postmodern critique, but we can't just stay within this postmodern critique that undermines all possibility of knowing something, and if it taken to the extreme. So metamodernism tries to move beyond both. One of the social models proposed that exemplifies a metamodern kind of politics is called listening society, which seeks to kind of move beyond the crisis of liberal democracy, capitalism and socialism, and technocratic governance, and to better address psychological and existential needs of individuals in societies and introduce a more responsive kind of government that listens more carefully to to those it governs. So that's clearly an important goal, and so we'll look at that in the future and look at the details, pros and cons of that perspective and other alternative perspectives within metamodernism. So listening society is not the only model proposed. So much so much for modernism and colonialism for the time being. Let's now take a look at posthumanism. So first of all, so that terminology is clear, sometimes all of these perspectives I'm about to discuss are included under this broad and general umbrella of post-humanist thought. But there are distinctions which we need to make, and I will be making them because they're important. To begin with, there's this critical post-humanism. And that's similar to kind of postmodernism critiquing modernity, modernism and modernity. Posthumanism is critiquing humanism, classical humanism. And that's a dominant theoretical posthumanist perspective. It criticizes humanism by focusing on the boundaries between animal, human, and machine, which, within humanism, there were very clear, clearly defined, solid, impenetrable barriers. But this new posthumanist thought describes them as porous and permeable. And the 1985 Cyborg Manifesto by Donna Haraway is probably the most famous formulation of this critical posthumanist perspective. Other names associated with this critical posthumanism are Rossi Braidotti, Catherine Hales, and Carrie Wolf. And we'll look at that in the future. I'll provide also a link to the Cyborg Manifesto for you to read if you want. So much like, as I said, much like postmodernism critiqued modernism, posthumanism critiqued humanist thought and the certainties that it proposed. And both perspectives grapple with the limits of human reason and rationality and the very definition of what a human subject is. These two perspectives are also complemented by postcolonialism. It completes this kind of triumvirate of posts by deconstructing the imperialist and colonial narratives, specifically decolonizing culture and history. So as a Ukrainian, for example, my goal is on this channel is to deconstruct the Russian imperial history, which distorted the Ukrainian experience and truth of Ukrainian experience in favor of the Moscow-centered narrative, right? So there are uses for post-colonial and postmodernism, but we need to move beyond just exclusively being skeptical, but also towards construction of new understanding. Next is transhumanism. Transhumanism, by contrast with critical posthumanism, instead of critiquing or deconstructing humanism, it actually keeps to the anthropocentric and exceptionalist perspective. Exceptionalist meaning that human beings are somehow privileged and exceptional with regard to the natural order of things, that they are destined to dominate nature and use it for only for human purposes as much as necessary and without regard. So that perspective is not critiqued by transhumanism. It's actually adopted, and actually the focus is mostly on transcending and transforming humanism. That's why, hence, transhumanism is. So they want to transform what it means to be human through technological enhancement. So that perspective emerged also in the middle of the 20th century. It is very technocentric, fundamentally scientific, also science-centered, fundamentally optimistic and utopian with regard to the future, technological future. Today, it's very common among the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, engineers, and so on, and similar groups in technology, various fields of technology. You can think of nanotechnology, biotechnology, genetic engineering, AI, neural networks, mind downloading, virtual reality, augmented reality, and other similar technologies being developed, and projects that are cheerfully touted as enhancements of humanity and unmistakable signs of progress, right? So that's the perspective of transhumanists. In some of the wildest fantasies of these transhumanists, they think that these advances may even solve, quote unquote, the problems of aging, disease, and death. That's some of their, kind of the wilder predictions. There's also this notion of extropy, which is opposed to entropy. Entropy is the second law of thermodynamics, which states that the world tends toward greater disorder. That's what gives our reality the dimension of one-directional time. Things in nature, when left to their own devices, tend to move from greater order to greater chaos on the whole, through decay, decomposition, breaking down, mixing, and so on. So it takes effort to introduce order into things. And, if we think about, let's say, anthill, it takes a lot of effort from the ants to create an order within that hill. And it's very easily disrupted if that order is not maintained continually. So same thing about anything else. So these people who are focused on extropy are imagining that can be somehow prevented or reversed. I will have to explore this a little bit further, because I don't understand how they can think that they can transcend the very laws of physics, but apparently they do. So some of these predictions they project that there is so-called technological singularity, by which they mean the integration of AI and human intelligence, or in other words, AI outperforming humans on every possible respect. That's the point of singularity that they are cheering on. So some say that may be reached by 2045. That's just a prediction, and that would usher in a new era of post-human evolution. That's their kind of very optimistic prediction. An acronym was created to group a number of various ideologies growing in this kind of environment around transhumanism, and that acronym is TESCREAL. That's TESCREAL. I will include a link to a couple of articles. You can explore what TESCREAL stands for and what it means. And some of the prominent thinkers that are associated with transhumanist perspective are Nick Bostrom, I think he's a British philosopher, Ray Kurzweil, and Max More. And again, we'll explore some of these in the future in greater depth. So we looked at critical posthumanism and transhumanism. Now, my own perspective in this channel that I will be exploring and that I will be defending in some ways, or as I explore it and as I learn about it more and invite you on that journey. So that's metahumanism. Obviously, that's a name. While technically it also falls within, as I said, this broader category of post-humanist thought, metahumanism is distinct from both of the previous two perspectives I just discussed. It continues the post-humanist critique and turns it on post-humanism itself. So it goes beyond post-humanism, and that's meta, it means beyond. Metahumanism makes different emphases than post-humanism, critical post-humanism, let's say, moves beyond that post-humanist perspective, and much like metamodernism, for example, moves beyond both postmodernism and modernism. So as I said, meta means beyond, and within philosophy, it's obvious in such words as metaphysics, beyond physics, right? So it's speculation about reality that is not physically accessible. It's not part of physical reality. It's more of something spiritual or other dimensions. So that's metaphysics, the nature of reality, the branch of philosophy that explores nature of reality. Also, meta-analysis is another term used. It's just analyzing beyond analysis, so analyzing it, or meta-ethics. Meta-ethical perspective is a philosophical investigation of ethics as a field. So it's kind of a next level of thinking. It's abstraction, next level of abstraction in terms of thinking. And it also, that term meta is now familiar to almost anyone today because of such ideas as Metaverse being advertised by Mark Zuckerberg and his company, basically hijacking that prefix, that word for commercial purposes, because actually Metaverse, in proper terms, it represents a transhumanist perspective based on algorithmic control, not a metahumanist perspective. So that's why Metaverse, basically, just to quickly define it, it's a virtual, immersive, and an interconnected digital space where users can interact, socialize, work, create experiences through augmented reality, virtual reality, and other advanced technologies. That's the kind of the definition of Metaverse. It is often envisioned as a persistent, shared, and decentralized digital universe that blends physical and virtual worlds. That's this utopian kind of imagination at work. And so I want to make very clear that right from the start, metahumanism and metamodernism as philosophical and aesthetic positions are in some ways antithetical to transhumanism and to Zuckerberg's Metaverse. Both metahumanism and metamodernism emerged in the late 1990s or early 2000s in response to, as I said, to the critiques of posthumanism and transhumanism and postmodernism, right? So there is that inherent opposition to some extent. These meta perspectives and the metaverse are not related. They seek very different ends, and they're, as I said, in some ways more opposed than not, even if not entirely incompatible in all respects. So Metaverse springs from the corporate and the digital technological reality, so business, digital technology. That's the substance from which this perspective sprung up. While both metahumanism and metamodernism are more ethical, aesthetic, and philosophical perspectives, so very different origins. And they look at the reality, try to engage with this concept of metaverse and with the changes happening with new technologies, in a critical manner and in a more skeptical manner, not so much optimistic and utopian. To further clarify things, metahumanism does not necessarily reject all transhumanist arguments in a wholesale manner. That would actually be a rigidly dogmatic position and and opposed to the very idea of humanism or metahumanism, the principles, I mean. But it is definitely opposed to algorithmic control, unsupervised and unrestrained, and is much more critical and pessimistic about the role that technology has to play in our daily lives. Metahumanism isn't reactionary or technophobic. Technology is here to stay. We're not going to reverse the clock. Entropy is moving forward. We can't move time back, so we have to just learn to live with everything. Just like, in the past, TV, radio, and new technologies came in, or printing press revolutionized the culture and technology and dissemination of ideas. And so this is just another stage, and we just need to approach it carefully and with the appropriate perspective and understand it correctly, without undue optimism or undue pessimism. It's somewhere like maybe critical realism is a good way to describe it, and we'll take a look at that. What critical realism is. There is actually a perspective called out critical realism, and we'll look at that in one of the future episodes. So, so it's not technophobic. Metahumanism is not, but the primacy of human, or metahuman, if you will, is a key position. So, in some ways, metahumanism also seeks to transcend and improve upon what is human, or what we so far understood as being human, but so similarly to transhumanism, it wants to transcend the maybe certain boundaries, but not in the same way. Metahumanism is focused more on transforming human consciousness and identity, while transhumanism is literally focused on technocentric approach and human-machine interfaces and bodily enhancements, literally. So we will explore that in greater detail in future episodes as well. Metahumanism may also be seen as having many points of intersection with both ecological posthumanism and ethical posthumanism. These are two additional perspectives within this family of posthumanist thought. We will examine those in detail in future, but just to sum them up briefly at this point, they seek to expand the humanist perspective beyond anthropocentrist ethics to include machines, AI, ecosystems, animals, and at times some of the philosophers and thinkers include even non-living matter into moral consideration, into moral and ethical philosophy. So in addition to the names mentioned in relation to the critical posthumanism, such as Haraway, Braidotti, and Wolff, and so on, other relevant thinkers here are Bruno Latour, author of the Action Network Theory, who includes such entities as rivers, mountains, and machines into ethical considerations, for example. Another thinker is Sylvia Wynter, the author of what is known as decolonial posthumanism. Again, a very connection to postcolonialism, and we'll look at that. Tim Morton is another one, and some others. These two perspectives, ethical and ecological posthumanism, they incorporate post-structuralist thought, bioethics, decolonial theory, deep ecology, new materialism, and variety of indigenous thoughts, indigenous traditions of thought, non-Western, non-dominant, in rejecting and moving beyond anthropocentrism. They have that in common. They overlap in many ways, and they also have a lot in common with metahumanism in some respects. Excuse me. And now, I know this may sound like a lot, this meta, post, humanism, modernism, colonialism, makes your head spin a little bit. So that's too much, too abstract to wrap your head around. I plan to post a detailed write-up about all these different perspectives that I discussed on my Medium blog as an accompanying article to this video, where I can include some further explanations, clarifications, and maybe comparisons to distinguish each of these perspectives and to provide some reading recommendations for those interested in exploring it further. So again, it may seem like a lot. It seems like we're all inundated by all these, overwhelmed by all these various post-Marxism, post-Freudianism, post-Darwinism, post-Nietzscheanism, post-liberalism, post-war, post-communism, post-Soviet period, and now this monster of post-truth, politics, and propaganda. And here, actually, I want to mention another YouTube channel, Vlad Vaxler. He's a British philosopher who has a great channel, and he talks a lot about post-truth, about politics, and analyzes events, current events. Also, I recommend looking him up, and I'll include the link. I enjoy watching his videos and explaining some of the current events that happened in past few months, for example. He's very, very calm, very reasoned, and provides great feedback. So this kind of sense of being overwhelmed is partly the reason why we need philosophy and clarity to make sense of all these posts and meta perspectives. Let me assure you that it's not too much. All these concepts and theoretical perspectives can be unpacked and will be unpacked and examined critically, systematically in detail, and so that both you and I can understand them better and critique their shortcomings or highlight the advantages. They also have direct relation to how we live and what we practice in daily lives. That's one of the points of philosophy to me, is to, as I emphasized in my previous videos, in terms of relation between philosophy and practical life, I want to bring up this famous quote by Karl Marx, actually, who wrote in his thesis on Feuerbach, that's another German philosopher. He wrote in 1845, specifically its 11th thesis, he wrote that the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it, right? So that's the quote. Well, we all know some of the ways in which Marxist philosophy and political theory have affected the world. And that's terrible historical lesson for everybody, which will be examined repeatedly on this channel, because given my Ukrainian background and given how influential Marxism has been and continues to be in the world even today. So that critique of Marxism notwithstanding, political Marxism specifically, I do agree with Marx that philosophy should not be satisfied with just merely describing, explaining, or interpreting the world in a passive manner, but its point is also indeed to change it to ideas, bring a new understanding and new concepts in. And that's what the task of the philosopher really is to create new concepts and new ways of understanding new realities. However, that change must come not by justifying any means and methods to achieve some predetermined ends based on abstract fantasies and utopias that go against all empirical evidence and very nature of the human experience we all share. That is a wrong way to go. It makes little difference whether these utopias are about classless and stateless societies, or they are about hierarchical societies based on total algorithmic control. The outcomes are bound to be similarly dystopian. So history has much to teach all of us, and if we would only listen. I think this is a good point to end for today. There are several directions opening up as to where I can take this in the future episodes, and I'll make some decisions. But sooner or later, I do intend to take a more in-depth and personal look at metahumanism and what it actually means in theory and practice, and what I personally find most appealing about it, or my version of metahumanism, if you will, is. We all have to adopt our own. We use ideas and just make them our own. That's the only way to proceed. Because, as I already mentioned, this is a journey of exploration for me as well, and I'm just inviting you along on the ride, so to speak. We will also take a closer look at what truth is, definitely in relation to this post-truth politics I mentioned, and how not to get it drowned in this present flood the zone strategies involved in post-truth propaganda. Again, as always, please support Ukraine. I include the links in every description of every video. Please donate if you can, or look for other ways, and I will, maybe in the future, I will come up with some more additional ways you can support and describe it in more detail. That's one of the future episodes. We'll just focus directly on that conflict. And please support this channel, like, share, subscribe, tell your friends to watch the videos, and so on. All support matters, and for me being able to continue doing this, and so I will encourage you to support. And I think that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.